Now, thanks everyone for joining to this session from Order to Outcome, Unpacking Responsible Purchasing Practices. My name is Melissa Caradona, and I am the Purchasing Practices Program Lead at the Ethical Trading Initiative. Lovely to see so many of you. And please, for those who come in, please just join and take a seat. It's all very relaxed. Just a big background on for the people who do not or are not familiar with ETI. ETI is an alliance of businesses, NGOs, and trade unions all working together on human rights and worker labor rights in global supply chain. I think a lot of you know us from the ETI base code, and we essentially have company members, NGO members, and trade union members all working on specific sector groups. So apparel and textiles, food farming and fisheries, but also general merchandise, which is basically everything except the other two. Just to set the tone a bit, when I'm speaking about purchasing practices today, I'm speaking about the buying decisions a purchasing company makes in order to procure a raw material, a service, or a good from a supplying business. And obviously, if we're looking at irresponsible purchasing behaviors, such as price pressures or tight lead times or excessive sampling, penalties and discounts, long payment terms, and unequal relationships, this all has impacts on suppliers, financial strains, eroded profit margins, resources diversions, delayed in cash flows, and unfair demands. And that all has impacts on workers as well, thinking of like lower wages, job insecurity, excessive overtime, disrupted workflow, anxiety, mental health, stress, pressure to meet targets, delayed in wages, and sometimes even not even getting the wage they actually deserve. And that again has looping back, basically like a domino back on the brands and purchasing companies as well, because it could hurt their regulatory demands, their consumer pressure, their quality, also delayed orders and poor relationship within the supply chain, which often affects transparency. As I said, ETI has been working on purchasing practices for quite a while now. We focused on apparel and textile, general merchandise, and food farming and fisheries. We have been starting to work on the purchasing practices, I think, like 10, 14 years ago with the ETI guide and buying responsibly. And then within the apparel and textile industry, in collaboration with the working group on RPP, which includes Fair Wear Foundation, Solidaridad, GIZ, IGS, we worked on the common framework for responsible purchasing practices in the apparel and textile industry, the learning implementation community, the RPP resource hub just recently got released, and the accountability framework on purchasing practices. And general merchandise, we then later also created another one, a common framework for manufacturing industries that now has been translated into Bengali, Hindi, and Mandarin. We worked on a manufacturing industry initiative where we worked with brands, suppliers, workers to see how we could improve purchasing practices. We did pilot projects in Bangladesh, China, and India for that work as well. For that, we created a research report. And then for food farming and fisheries, we're actually kicking off as we speak. We're currently doing a project on an RPP assessment in the banana industry, and also doing work on shrimp supply chains, as well as we've done work on the fresh produce in Italy and Spain on responsible purchasing practices. So I think like many businesses are committed to human rights and environmental due diligence. And traditionally, I think the focus is very much has been on improving working conditions in production countries, often asking suppliers to make changes. So we focus a lot on auditing and trainings for suppliers, health and safety programs, wage compliance, and grievance mechanisms. And I think while some of these measures are really important, there is I think by themselves, they are not just enough, and especially as expectations on HREDD are rising. So I think it's really equally important and often very much overlooked is how the way purchasing companies and make decisions on policies and their practices, and what the effects are in the entire supply chain. And I think with that in mind, ETI has created a common framework. This is the common framework for responsible purchasing practice in manufacturing industry, the most recent one. It is essentially a reference document, guidelines on how companies can improve their purchasing practices. Principle one focuses very much on like internal integration. So looking at the buying company itself, like what decisions do commercial and sustainability teams make? Are they in contact with each other? Our commercial teams, do they have KPIs set to their targets on social and environment? Do they get training? Principle two is very much on like equal partnership, looking at the relationship between the supplier and the buyer. So looking at, is there a commitment from the brand towards the supplier? Is it a long-term stable relationship? It's a bit of a partnership approach. Do companies get incentivize suppliers that are doing well? Principle three, collaborative production planning. So looking at lead times, forecasting, sampling, technical specification. So very much nitty-gritty of actually doing the procurement. Principle four on fair payment and contract terms, looking, as you speak, shortening term payment timelines, maybe avoiding penalties and discounts, looking at how contracts are written. So is there a bit of like shared responsibility within the contracts? And then principle five is on sustainable costing. So making sure that prices enable at least a minimum wage, supplier profit margins, making sure that environmental and social standards are included. And then within this principle, we're also looking at living wages. Just to say, these people couldn't be here today, some of the suppliers, so we recorded a quick video so that you can hear from suppliers on what their purchasing practices look like. I have to quickly switch to this screen because it doesn't work.
There are 3, 4 major issues which, from a supplier's perspective, we feel that they should be addressed and looked into it. It starts with the pricing, the fair pricing. You see, all over the world, there is a pressure on fair wages to be paid to your workers, to staff, and sourcing is sustainable. To meet both these goals, a product pricing should be fair also. If you don't get a fair price, you cannot make sure that your workers are paid fair. Second thing is a sustainable lead time. If your lead time is not realistic and sustainable, then you put pressure on the environment, you pressure on your workforce, everything. So we must find a balance where we meet the customer demand, we meet the fashion changes demand, but we get a reasonable production time to produce that. Third is to avoid the last minute changes. This creates the additional pressure on your resources. You have to work faster. And third thing is the payment terms. You need to be honest with your supply chain partners. If you are not being paid as a supplier, we are not getting paid, or we're not getting paid on time, it creates pressure for us. And then it is not a sustainable business model in a long run. It purely becomes an opportunistic way of doing business, which is not a good thing. And so we, from supplier point of view, the payment security, I mean, whatever payment terms you negotiate, that has to be honored and secured. This is the concern. These are 3, 4 concerns from supplier's perspective, which are important.
The sustainability in terms of sourcing and the environmental impacts, such as reducing waste and ensuring fair labor standards. We need to work together and not make it purely the manufacturer's responsibility. And for some customers, they are asking what the wages are for the workers and whether we can increase it into a fair wage. But if the target price is very low, we need to ask them to increase the price to accommodate that. Some are willing to discuss that, but some are not.
The first thing that I would consider very important is the lead time. For a basic product, or for a simpler product, or for a repeat product, we could do it within a normal span of time, which they usually give. That would be, say, 70 or 80 days. But when the product is complex, it has different processes, they should ask us first how many days would it be possible in finishing the goods, and then fix the lead time. rather than just simply fixing that we just need it in 2 months or not. That puts us in a very pressure situation. Also, some of our customers persuade us to give low prices because they have learned that a particular garment manufacturer who also owns dyeing, printing, and the mills, they're able to give the cost of a garment at a much lower price. Understanding that they want that price from us as well. And they should understand that we are just a garment manufacturer and we outsource those activities in a dyeing and a printing with a separate supplier. And the costs are going to be high with this. They do not understand that situation and they expect our prices to be similar to a person with an integrated setup. Generally, the costs of various things, the raw materials, the cost of labor, and everything increases year on year. They do not understand that and say, last year my price was $2, and now they say, why is it being $2.10? I need it at the same price, and I will not be able to change it. Hence, they need to talk with us, understand the situation, what's happening in our country, and then make decisions with us on the prices.
I think it's really good to hear from like suppliers on what their issues are, but I also have a few questions for you. So if you could all please get your phones out and scan the QR code on the side. I hope it works. I was a bit late for printing, so apologies for that, but I hope technology allows us to scan the QR code. Yeah, sorry.
Otherwise,
Um,
online,
yeah, just have to move it. So the first question, which purchasing practices create the biggest challenges in today's global supply chains? And I would like to hear from you. I mean, there's no right, wrong answer. No one's being examined. So please feel free to add in what you think is the biggest challenge in today's global supply chain. So price pressure from buyers, a very good one. Pricing and lead times, fair price. I see in pricing that doesn't take into account living wages and inflation. More on price, lack of long-term buyer and supplier relations, very good one. Additional costs, materials. I think the room has a good idea of what challenges are. Thank you. Moving on to the next question, as I can't scroll down. Which change in current practices would make the most difference for workers? So what do you think that would be? Living wage, fair. Buyer education on price relations to labor to forced labor, increase the price, leverage of power imbalance, reinforcing labor wages, union collectivism, living wage integrating into prices. All very good answers. Thanks very much. And then last questions I have is what would motivate buying companies most to adopt responsible purchasing practices? So also look at it, their point of view a little bit. Legislation, very important one. We can do more of that. CCDD, showing long-term business case, regulation, risk mitigation, legal requirements, threats, funny one, fair prices and consistent orders, buyer pressure, more campaigns, all very good points you've raised. I mean, I think you all get the gist of it. So just moving on to the panel discussion, I'm going to interview, like that was me speaking for today. I think I'm going to introduce you to a very nice panel of people, starting with Shansita Saxena, professional faculty and senior advisor at Article 1. Rick Lamble, founder and CEO of Beyond Sustainability Retail Group. Alok Sinch, Regional Director, Southeast Asia at the Ethical Trading Initiative, and Mansi Gupta, Gender, Responsible Business and Human Rights Consultant at Color Consulting. And I think looking at the video, I will just start to ask a question to Shansita on like, why is a partnership or responsible purchasing approach between retailer and supplier important in today's global context, considering like factors like tariffs or climate change and supply chain pressures? And maybe you can share an example where such partnerships reduce labor risks.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Melissa. So I think, there was a academic researcher who about 10, or maybe actually longer than that, 20 years ago said, with respect to how we understand labor rights and labor conditions in global supply chains, he said, I think we've been looking in the wrong place. And I think that's just, a sort of a basic way to start this conversation. And a lot of the background that Melissa said, I think for us who work in the space, we've been, wondering why we don't see the dramatic improvements to labor conditions in global supply chains as we would expect. Not to say that there hasn't been attention to this issue. It's not for a lack of attention or lack of funding or lack of programming, but yet somehow we haven't seen the kind of movements that we would expect. And I think we've been looking at the wrong place kind of, is part of the explanation. For many decades, I think companies, brands, they really focused on the compliance approach. So sort of a carrot and stick, more of a stick, actually. If you don't comply, you must comply with all these things. If you don't, there's always a threat that we're going to leave you. Less about the carrot in terms of, we will reward you with more business if you do comply. So we moved from the compliance approach to then thinking about kind of the commitment approach. So then, brands started saying, well, we want to build capacity of our suppliers. So you saw some, sort of innovative programming around that. And I think now, with the way Melissa kind of set this up, where we are or where we are and should be going is really in this idea of shared responsibility. So which is a really different way of thinking, certainly very different from compliance and from commitment, but really thinking about, well, what is the role of every actor in the supply chain? What is the role of the brand? How do brand actions negatively impact not only suppliers, but then ultimately workers? And so it was, your responses were all great because you basically you said like all the kinds of things that we know can be very harmful. We know that brand behavior in terms of quick change of timelines, pushing down on price, many of you mentioned price, those kind of actions, we know now, like there's enough research, there's enough evidence to show the links between gender-based violence and harassment, excessive overtime, general degradation to physical and mental health of workers. We know that there's direct correlations between brand action and these conditions. So why should we even think about partnerships and this shared responsibility model? From looking at it from a brand perspective, some of the research that I started doing talking to both brands and suppliers started during the pandemic. So 5 years ago, during one of the strangest times probably in our near history, in terms of how the entire world was somehow impacted by this global pandemic. And at that time, so this idea of partnership is not new, but that idea, it became more salient. And a lot of the brands we talked to and we did interviews with started saying, well, we really need to understand our supply chain and we really need to know how to prepare for the next crisis. Everyone was kind of rattled by what had happened, during this pandemic. And so they wanted to start thinking about how do we move from this sort of very transactional type of relationship to something that's more collaborative, something what we would call a partnership. And so from the brand point of view, how you work with your suppliers could really, it makes sense, right? It's going to help you navigate a crisis like COVID, but there's multiple crises. There's global conflict. There are, every day there's a new thing about tariffs. There's, economic instability. There's so many other crises that are happening. It does make sense to know your supply chain well, to have a good relationship with your partners. One of the things, and at the same time we were doing over the last few years research with suppliers and trying to ask them about, well, what does a partnership look like to you? And I want to give you an example, just a quote from a supplier. And again, a lot of this follows, with the video that Melissa showed, like our kind of the research we've been doing with suppliers really kind of ties in with that. I just want to read this one quote because it kind of shows this idea of mutual benefit. Not only is it beneficial to brands, but it's also beneficial to suppliers and how they can work together. So this is a quote from a supplier interview in 2023. Sometimes we give the brand a discount. We feel we should support them. Sometimes we can't ship on time. Then they, the brand, supports us. One of our customers sent us a letter during COVID saying we will go through this together. It may take time, but eventually we will take these products. Later, they asked us for a discount, but we were okay with it. The brand had tried their best to minimize the loss. We felt we should help them reduce the price. So it's this idea that like we're working together on this. Yes, sometimes we might not be able to do something, but other times you may not be able to, but we will work together. So this is kind of a very a different way of really thinking about this relationship between brands and their suppliers. And then I want to just read one more quote before we move on. And that is this idea that many of you, again, I think were right on when you answered the survey, that this idea of realistic pricing, that's one of the constant things that like suppliers talk about all the time. Pricing is completely unrealistic, and you're expecting us to do all these things. There's a whole list of things that you want us to do, but yet you're not paying enough. And this, I have a quote here again from a supplier in 2023, which I thought was very telling. The buyer is saying we have to pay a living wage. Put your money where your mouth is, a supplier said. They have a lot of demands in terms of social standards, quality, but they are not ready to pay for that. So I think that kind of sums up really how suppliers feel. So I'll just end there.
Thanks very much, Shantita. I mean, I resonate with a lot of that, obviously. Also was in India and Bangladesh last week, and think the partnership approach is not just completely there yet. But I want to move on to Mansi, who has been working with us on some of the pilots we did in the stone industry in India. And basically, my question is, like, during our work we've done as part of the pilot, which changes in purchasing practices created the most notable shift for the workers, and how did these shifts demonstrate value of responsible purchasing practices in supporting human rights due diligence?
Sure, thanks, Melissa, and a very good morning, everyone. So I'll just share a snapshot of the pilot before answering your question. So Colors Consulting supported ETI. Am I audible? Yeah. So Colors Consulting had supported ETI in directly engaging with the supplier as well as the workers for a stone manufacturing supplier in Gwalior in Madhya Pradesh, which is located in central India. And we engaged with them in two phases. The first of which was to conduct an assessment to identify the interlinkages between the brand purchasing decisions and how it impacted the supplier business processes and the working conditions. And in the second phase, we went back to provide them technical assistance on the gaps on the human right commitments that we had identified during the first phase of the assessment. So, in terms of assessment, when we spoke with both workers and suppliers, with workers, what we saw was that they were unaware of any linkages of how the decisions are made at the buyer level and how it impacts their working realities. However, they were able to share some of the consequences which were felt by them. Most importantly, on the overtime, which would be lower in the lean season. However, whenever there was a sudden order placed by the purchasing companies, that is when the overtime would peak. In addition, there were certain observations that we made during the pilot process. For example, if you know, the extractives industry and especially the stone manufacturing industry is largely informal, and therefore formal contracts for workers are not provided, which also results in the workers not being aware of their rights. While the social security benefits are provided to permanent workers by the supplier, many of them were not aware that the employee state insurance, which is mandatory in India, which ensures health insurance, accidental insurance, as well as providing retirement benefits, the workers did not know how to access it. And these were not provided to the temporary workers who were hired during the peak season. Another observation was that there were no formal structures in place. Grievance mechanisms were highly informal, with which and particularly owner-led, and there was no worker representation across any of the committees. Health and safety equipments were provided to the workers, but there were no formal trainings provided for them to start using the equipments. And especially when it came to the temporary workers, their knowledge was found to be considerably lower than the permanent workers. When we spoke with suppliers about it, we heard some parallel stories, and they shared that while they were ready to commit to improving their human rights and labor practices, it required both time and financial investment, which they were ready to make. However, it was not feasible in an informal sector which they are a part of, where mostly the business decisions are based on the price points and not on the ethical business practices which the suppliers are following. Due to these, coupled with a few other purchasing practices decisions which were impacting them, they highlighted the lack of proper business forecasting, which I think has been mentioned previously during the session as well. And most importantly, mentioned the inefficiencies in the technical inputs that are provided and the untimely inputs that are provided, which badly affects their production cycle. Moreover, delayed payments was another area which the supplier said that puts them in a considerable financial strain, and they are more dependent on borrowing and credit lines as a result of it. And this did impact how they were making wage payments, or they were procuring materials and timely delivery um, of the product. Having identified these risk areas, the customer then agreed to focus on three parts. The first of which was they decided to have a more systematic order forecasting mechanism in place, where they looked at a material type procurement approach. So, what material they want to procure and how much. So, there were projections around that which were planned in advance. And every quarter, they decided to have procurement meeting with the suppliers. Sanchita also highlighted the importance of having an approach where both the buyers and suppliers have a strong discussion, and this is something that the buyer here ensured that they follow as a practice going forward. They also worked on improving their payment timelines, making sure that the payments were not delayed so that it reduces the financial stress. And lastly, they extended technical support to address the human rights knowledge gap which existed in the supply chain because of them not being able to follow these through, either because the compliance requirements were minimal, or because there were certain practices which were highly informal. The results that we got to see was a better engagement from the supplier side and acceptance to making these improvements and commitments. They felt seen and heard in the process. They also they initiated providing formal contracts to all the workers, not just temporary, not just permanent, but also temporary workers. And they engaged in a process of formulating their policies on grievance mechanisms and health and safety. They also constituted grievance committees with representation from workers, and they finally also worked on making the systems more inclusive. So I would say that, having identified these risks, uh, how responsible purchasing practices is generally seen is it's seen as an add-on to human rights due diligence. But in order to make it more motivating for the suppliers to participate and to make the system more robust, I think responsible purchasing practices has to be seen as a critical lever of human rights due diligence and not just as an add-on.
Thanks, Mansi. That's very good. I mean, we talk a lot about responsible purchasing practices in dairy, and I think she gave a great example of how that could turn out in practice and having the worker perspectives. Want to move on a bit more to policy and explore how policy can support on scaling responsible purchasing practices. So, Alok, what strategies have you seen work best to embed responsible purchasing practices across supply chains and involving suppliers, workers, and policymakers?
Thanks. What I would say that at ETI, we have been working on responsible purchasing practices across multiple sectors, including apparel and textiles, general merchandise. And very recently, we have started looking at RPP in food supply chain, which includes banana and shrimp farming. And from these areas of work, we have seen few strategies that help embed responsible purchasing practices across the supply chain, which involves suppliers, workers, as well as policymakers. Now, I'll talk about four such strategies. First and foremost is about creating a common framework. Now, why the common framework is required is an important question. Now, problem is that different players, they interpret responsible purchasing practices in a different manner. And that's where you need a framework that clearly defines the structure, the guidance, as well as shared language, which can, help what a good purchasing practices looks like. It actually helps break down the silos that exist within the companies. You see, there's hardly, a discussion happening between the sustainability as well as the commercial team as such. So somewhere a good framework would actually try and bring both the units together and engage on a similar discussion happening across the company as such. And this is really critical because it's actually leads to shifting the onus of responsible purchasing practices from the CSR team to something that sits at the heart of the business itself. And then the second strategy that we are looking at is collaborating to raise standards. Now, there are companies and initiatives who have made progress, but when it comes to wider industry, they still fall short of the norms that are required. And recognizing this, ETI has been working with the Responsible Purchasing Practices Working Group, which Melisha highlighted about, and has developed a Responsible Purchasing Practices Due Diligence Framework. Now, this is not a lowest common denominator standard, but it is highly ambitious as it sets out what good actually looks like and addresses some of the known risks and is designed to support continuous improvement happening across the supply chain rather than simply validating the problematic industry norms that exist. The third point that we look at is enabling uh, clear rules and accountability. Now, through purchasing practices HRDD framework, we are now providing guidance not only to companies but also to policymakers or regulators. Uh, and then we are looking at this framework uh, from both what responsible and what irresponsible practices look like and align with the expectation across the industry. Again, this is completely grounded in lived experiences, as well as it is built on international standards and adapted to different sectors' realities as such. Now, this really creates a stronger, basis for accountability and enables external actors to push companies towards genuine changes happening in the industry. And then it is a meaningful stakeholder engagement. Now, if we need successful responsible purchasing practices to happen in the industry, it requires hearing and acting on the suggestions which are provided by different stakeholders within the supply chain as such. It also requires governments to play a role in terms of shaping up policies which encourages due diligence and accountability within the supply chain as such. And then brands are naturally required to engage with the suppliers to understand how some of the purchasing practices that they have has an impact on their business as well as on the working conditions of the workers. So somewhere, suppliers should have, a open discussion with the buyers as such. And as an example, in the ETI's RPP work, we developed a survey wherein suppliers were providing feedback to the buyers with regard to the impact of purchasing practices of buyers on their business as well as the impact it has on the workers as such. Now, this really gives useful insights when it comes to some of the critical issues, as Mansi had highlighted, and that then it creates, a platform for a continuous dialogue happening across buyer and suppliers, and also supplier and the workers, which is going to be very, very productive going ahead.
Thanks, Alok. Very useful. I mean, meaningful stakeholder engagement is obviously very important, and often we see that suppliers are not really able to share their challenges. They rather solve it internally because the power imbalances are so quick. So they're afraid to lose business. So therefore, just keep things quiet and just don't do anything about it. So I think like meaningful stakeholder engagement to explore that a bit deeper. I think that's a good one. And moving on to Rick. Rick has quite a good background in retail. So I wanted to ask Rick. He has been working with retail companies and brands and supermarkets on responsible purchasing practices. So why did the retailer decided to review purchasing practices, and how did you engage like leadership and commercial teams to support this work on responsible purchasing practices?
Thanks, Melissa. So yeah, as Melissa notes, my business Beyond, we cut across a number of retail sectors: apparel, homewares, and food. But today my comments are going to relate primarily to my time at Kmart Group in Australia. So for those not familiar with Kmart, it's a large apparel homewares retailer, and that sources across Asia. So the Kmart Group story. So I was head of sustainability for about 10 years until early last year, and we worked on responsible purchasing probably for about 7-8 years in my time there. Now, what was the drivers to get started? Actually, they were both commercial and human rights drivers that came up. So the business had a long-term approach, an investment in long-term partnerships with suppliers and wanting, respectful, open partnerships with them. So investing in responsible purchasing, formally assessing performance, was just sort of a logical extension for the business, and the way it operated. It was seen as a great opportunity to gather feedback and identify further opportunities for improvement. And I think ultimately for our sourcing leadership, they wanted to be positioned as a customer of choice for suppliers. All right, so they saw real strategic value. At the same time, we had obviously a human rights strategy, which of course is where I came in, and a focus around living wage. And so around 2015, 2016, Kmart Group joined the ACT partnership. So for those not familiar with ACT, it's a global partnership between industrial, global union, and international brands and retailers in the garment sector, with a focus on living wage through promoting collective bargaining agreements at a national level, supported by responsible purchasing practices by brands. So as part of our commitment to the ACT partnership, we were implementing the ACT global purchasing practice commitments. And so that process sort of started around, I guess, 2016, 2017 for us. So I suppose, perhaps this is slightly unusual in the industry, but there was actually almost like a meeting of minds between the sourcing leaders and sustainability leaders in the business. And, we saw great benefit from purchasing practices, improving purchasing practices. So how did we get started? So around 2017, we did our first responsible purchasing assessment. And we actually piloted both the Better Buying Initiative and the ACT responsible purchasing commitments at that time. We then expanded probably around 2020 to a much larger assessment through the ACT process, involving probably about 100 suppliers, 100 buying and sourcing team members internally. So really looked at it comprehensively. And from there, we built our first responsible purchasing roadmap, which was then reassessed around 2023 to see, where we'd improved and, further opportunities for improvement. So, we had a broad, I guess, business commitment to work on RPP and living wage, but that doesn't mean it's easy, right? Working with, the commercial teams. And so in those, those early days, you do, as the sustainability team, you have to spend a lot of time on sort of education awareness about understanding the importance of RPP and what it means. And I think, for commercial teams, there's also a natural sort of reaction to talking about RPP and living wage, which is this sounds really uncommercial. Are we going to be forced into suddenly, losing flexibility on our sourcing decisions? Are we going to be asked to suddenly pay higher prices overnight, which is, going to make us uncompetitive? So you do get a bit of that sort of, tension and that sort of reaction. And so, from the sustainability human rights side, your team, you really do need to spend a good amount of time learning the buying and sourcing business, and for me, and anyone else who's done this, working on responsible purchasing, understanding the buying process, costing, forecasting. It's not what you didn't start your career thinking about this stuff, and it's probably one of the hardest things I've done in my career, but it's really important to understand where they're coming from so you can have, those intelligent conversations, both with your commercial team, but also, suppliers as well. So, a lot of education awareness discussions in the early days, but what happens is that once you get past that, everyone sort of starts to lean in. And when you do these assessments, you have these amazing conversations, workshops and meetings. You have buying, sourcing team members who have perhaps never thought about deeply how their decisions have a flow-on effect for suppliers and especially workers. So I think, implicitly everyone wants to feel like they're doing the right thing and working respectfully with their partners, but you start to see that they realize, oh, that last minute order change that actually resulted in excessive overtime or pressure on suppliers and other ways as well. So I think there's just a real two-way learning process that happens with both your commercial teams and the sustainability teams. And so just to, I guess, to wrap up my points here, my main message to brands and retailers is just to get started and do your first, purchasing assessment. When I started researching this topic 20 years ago, there were no, we've talked about price pressure and all these things for years, right? Decades, but there were no standards and frameworks at that time that you could look to. That's not the case anymore. Of course, you've got the common framework, you have better buying, you have the ACT approach as well. So there's really no excuse, for brands that it's within their control to do better, to think critically about their purchasing and how they can, do it better longer term. And as I mentioned, I think there's really great, value to be unlocked for business as well, as ultimately benefits for workers.
Thanks, Rick. I mean, when we first started working on the pilot project in the manufacturing industry, we did the supplier survey, as Alok said, and then we showed it to the buyers, and they were like, I had no idea my impact decisions on changing technical specification had such big impact on 25,000 workers. And she was a bit shocked that like something that seems so small can have such tremendous effects in like how working conditions play out. Want to move on back to Shansita a bit on lessons learned. So what kind of practical strategies have you seen work effectively to support RPP and regions or global supply chains that you worked in?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I mean, with respect to the partnerships that we were talking about earlier as sort of a critical part in thinking about the shared responsibility and good purchasing practices, unfortunately, I have to say, we're not there yet. We are talking about it, which is great, but we see very few examples of really sort of what we would call good partnerships or very like shared responsibility partnerships. One of the things that this research has done is it shows a kind of a wide range. So the term partnership is used now. It's a lot more common. So for example, we did this analysis of publicly available documents for about 20 brands, and you actually see in a lot of statements the term partnership, and they talk about it in terms of the relationship with the suppliers. But it's also, if you look at it carefully, a lot of it, what is saying is it's still using sort of the idea of leverage. Now, one-sided leverage is not the same as partnership. So if you're using a partnership to push suppliers to do things that you want them to do, that is actually going back to sort of a compliance framework. It's just we're calling it partnership now. So it's not really a partnership. We found a wide range of practices that were falling under, quote unquote, partnership, but it's arranged everything from, some sort of were mutually beneficial relationships, but other were more like, well, we're a partner until something bad happens, like there's an economic crisis or there's the war in Ukraine or something else and then no longer we're a partner. So it's a very, unstable partnership. The most kind of egregious example was really under the sort of almost using it as a form of blackmail. So, you're our partner, therefore you should really, lower your price and you should give us huge discounts and et cetera, et cetera. But again, it's framing, the conversation is being framed around partnership, which is a very positive thing and which, evokes this idea of a shared responsibility. So all that to say is, unfortunately, we're not there yet, but where we can think about, there's maybe three things, there's more, I'm sure, but sort of three things we can think about to, start moving in the direction of a relationship that would actually be more productive. So one is, it's something very basic, but a clear definition and understanding on both sides of what a partnership is. So there should not be this idea that brands think, well, we're using our leverage to make you do things. That's what we consider a partnership. And you talk to suppliers, they absolutely don't agree with that. So suppliers talk about, again, what the video said, what many of you said, lead time, pricing, those constantly come up. But the other element is really this idea of commitment. And that's come up again and again from suppliers we spoke to who said, a partnership or any relationship really, there has to be some level of commitment. It can't be that, when things are going well, you're my partner. And then when something happens, then boom, you leave. And one of the things that this research is we are finding, and we're taking this idea that actually that may be even more harmful than not being a partner at all. So you can imagine in your own life, you have a good friend or a partner, romantic partner, business partner, whatever, who you expect certain things from. If that person suddenly, just totally goes back on their word, then the impact to you is going to be much more than if you didn't have a relationship with that person to begin with. So actually establishing a relationship, but then moving away is actually more harmful than not having it all. So this is kind of actually one of the insights, which has implications for, I think, what we can recommend to brands. The second is what Rick talked about, and totally agree, like, this idea of internal divisions and how we relate. The work I do with companies, I tend to work with sustainability folks and human rights folks, which, they're great people, but, they're, I'm preaching to the choir, they don't, they are not the ones that have to be convinced. They actually need help convincing their colleagues within the company. And so the more I work with companies, that's one of the things I find is that, there's, we, I guess, as human rights professionals actually need to do a lot more in terms of training internal divisions, and not only speaking to our colleagues who work on human rights, because again, that they're not the ones we're trying to convince. And to Melissa's point, I think, there's a great example of a colleague of mine who used to work for a large apparel company who actually gave the same example that he said, in his 20s, this was his first job, and he did not realize, and he actually later on, so now he's in human rights and business, but he said, I didn't realize actually how pressing a button could result in, and pressing a button to basically change the timeline for an order by like moving it up, how that can impact like mental health of women workers in Bangladesh. Like it seems so, distant, like how can that possibly relate? But in fact, it does. And making those connections to internal divisions who would not know that is actually really important. And, maybe doing it with, like these kind of videos are actually really important. I think companies should be doing them. And then finally, this idea of, I don't know if we probably don't have time to talk about in detail, but the idea of, the responsible contracting project is a great example of how we think about putting things like this in a contractual form. It's shocking to me, both from brands and talking to brands and suppliers, that oftentimes a lot of these things are, oh, it's a verbal, we talked about it. I was like, well, where's the contract? Oh, no real contract. Oh, maybe there was an email, but there's no legally binding way that you're really establishing this partnership, and what are the commitments on both sides? Kind of verbal, kind of said it, didn't say it. And then, it's so easy to renege on that because there is absolutely nothing is holding you accountable. So really looking at responsibility, but how you have it through contracts, through legally binding agreements, I think are essential. And finally, I'll just end with, an example of, this is a, fairly smaller company. They have a very interesting partnership model, which, again, this is not realistic, I think, for many companies. You can't really expect this, but they actually, from their head office, they go and they have an embedding sort of approach where they embed themselves with the supplier, and they share the values, they train, they build capacity, but they get to know each other. That to me is the ultimate example of developing a relationship. You're spending like 6 months with the supplier, and yes, you have a relationship after that. I mean, you know them, you've just spent all this time with them, and then they understand your values, and then they hopefully behave, you both behave in the ways that are, really upholding the shared responsibility. Not that is, again, I'm not promoting that as something that every company should do. That's not realistic, but again, that's sort of a positive example.
Thank you, Shansita. Yes, there was also talking to a shrimp processing firm here in Thailand, and they were saying that the Japanese in general is hard to get a good relationship with, but once that relationship is in, they would never leave, and they're a partner in good and bad times, which I thought was beautifully said. Moving on back to Mansi, maybe to show a bit of the indicators she could tell about like what evidence has resulted in from responsible purchasing practices on the workers.
So since we concluded the pilot in 2025, there's still evidence in progress as the suppliers working on the action items they created. However, they did focus on a few areas during the last phase of the pilot. First of which was they ensured that the employee state insurance reaches all the workers, not just the permanent, but also the temporary workers. So there was 100% enrollment of the existing workforce in the employee state insurance. The second thing they did was they organized health awareness camps and ESIC awareness camps to ensure that not just the workers but also their family members enrolled in the ESIC and they could avail the benefits of it. The third thing they did was they started working on their policies and systems. They started out with having a grievance redressal policy. They started framing it and working on the health and safety policy before they could focus on the trainings to improve the uptake of the personal protective equipments. In addition, they also committed to organizing worker welfare initiatives every quarter, focusing on identified needs. So they organized something called a Vichar Day, where they would have collaborative discussions with the workers to identify their felt needs and to address those during these 4 engagements that they had planned during the year. And most importantly, they realized the importance of formalizing their processes and working towards, identifying the gaps where they're employing mostly low literacy level workers, but then ensuring that they receive their contracts and they understand those contracts better. So when they constituted the grievance redressal committee, they had equal representation both from the management side and also from the worker side. So they would have the grievance redressal committee members from workers side to be present when the contracts were provided to all the workers, and in their presence the contracts were explained, and then the agreements were shared. So these were some of the things that they had started working on, and I think it's still in progress, but these were identified.
Thank you, Mansi. I think one of the great things of this pilot project was how responsible purchasing practices opened up HRDD and like issues on like human rights that actually normally would fall just with supplier, but because changing that dynamic in conversation they felt more trusted and like accepted as a partner, and therefore started implementing things themselves. So it has a bit of a positive trickle down effect on the suppliers and the workers as well. Moving back to Alok, a bit more on policy, like what could policy and regulatory incentives be to support retailers in embedding responsible purchasing practices?
Thanks. I think we are not there yet, but if you look at CSDDD, it's a important step in a right direction. We don't know how the final version is going to look like, but then it is important that the purchasing practices is a component of CSD, which is going to be there, and it requires companies to assess their own behavior in terms of purchasing practices in the supply chain as such. If you look at, currently the whole, approach of risk and responsibility for HRED, it is being, pushed to the suppliers and further down to the workers as such. But when it comes to discussions around lead times, pricing, cost pressures, somewhere there's hardly any room for due diligence as such. And if companies are required to examine their own buying behaviors, it certainly would create some kind of a meaningful change in terms of involving different actors, including suppliers and workers, with regard to their behavior. But all said, it is very difficult to have it in place because of the power dynamics that exist. It is very difficult for suppliers or workers to provide feedback to their buyers, again fearing repercussions when it comes to the business relationship as such. But we need to create structures through which we can capture some of these feedbacks or have a feedback loop. Workers certainly could be represented through unions or worker collectives. Similarly, one of the biggest challenge is with regard to suppliers and their voices, how that can, be brought to the company's discussion as such. And that's where we feel that different structures like, multi-stakeholder initiatives or suppliers' own global associations can initiate these discussions at the global level with regard to some of these impact of purchasing practices on suppliers, which ultimately translates into the workers as such. And this is also where the whole tool around purchasing practices due diligence framework can play a key role, as it provides a structured way for companies and also for policymakers to monitor them. So that's how we expect the whole discussion to move forward. Given the whole development around CSDDD is still not final. But again, the structures that can be built by buyers in terms of creating a feedback loop would be really, really helpful when it comes to any issues around purchasing practices.
Thanks, Alok. I think legislation will have such a massive impact. I know the CSDDD is a bit under revision and that there's a lot of negativity around like how that will shape. But I'm so glad that purchasing practices are still in there, because if they have to do risk analysis on their purchasing practices and purchasing practices are identified as a risk factor, I think we then have to take steps to mitigate those risks and remediate those risks. So I'm very glad that hopefully it will stay in. Moving back to Rick as final, could you maybe share some examples of work you've done with the retailers on purchasing practices and how that resulted in like better worker well-being and better supply relationships?
Thank you. So I want to focus my comments here around the connection between responsible purchasing and wages. So, I think this conference I've heard, a lot of talk about wages, living wage and price pressure and, the connection between all of these things. So my view on this is that responsible purchasing on its own will not result in wage increases for workers. All right. So responsible purchasing is really important, but ultimately you also need to connect to, national wage systems, minimum wage setting processes, collective bargaining agreements, and so on. So you have to think about the topic, obviously, comprehensively, not just purchasing practices. Now, that's not to say it's not important. And I just want to touch on briefly, both supplier and I guess brand perspectives around this. Now, from a supplier's perspective, even if you as a brand were to increase your prices, how can that supplier afford to pay workers more if it's only one brand customer, right? They need the majority of their brand customers to be paying more. And of course, suppliers would like, long-term stable orders as well. So, there needs to be collective action. And for each supplier, there has to be a business case about, how this works for them. Can they sustainably afford, wage growth over the long term? And then from the brand perspective, of course, the brands and particularly the commercial teams are thinking, well, how can I increase my prices without undermining our competitiveness as a business? And the brands are also thinking, if I pay higher prices, how do I know those benefits will ultimately reach the workers through greater wages and so on? So again, you have to look at it holistically. You need the accountability mechanisms. You obviously need the involvement of workers, worker representatives, as part of the overall processes as well. I just want to come back to the ACT partnership for a moment, because I think it's really exciting what is happening in Cambodia at the moment. So some of you may have heard this, but there is now a multi-employer collective bargaining agreement that has been negotiated through the ACT process in the garment industry in Cambodia. And that agreement, for the first time, it's an agreement negotiated between the Cambodian trade unions and employers, but there is a legally binding commitment from the brands in that partnership to support negotiated wages through that agreement, through better prices and a long-term commitment on orders. And I think that's the first time that has ever been achieved, certainly in that industry. Now, it's early days for that agreement. We've seen a number of suppliers opt in the past few months. Even in the last few days, we've heard an announcement from H&M Group that one of their key suppliers and 3 factories have signed up to that agreement. But I think it has huge potential, long-term potential, and those factories, if the agreement progresses, they're going to see real tangible benefits for both the factories and the workers over the next couple of years. So just again, a final, few thoughts there. One is, I think that model that's been developed by ACT, the binding commitments for brands around pricing and order commitments, I think that has potential in other industries and countries as well. But coming back to responsible purchasing for the brands, as I mentioned before, it starts from starting with an assessment. Look critically at your buying, sourcing practices, and where you can improve. Costing, pricing is just one aspect. There's obviously a range of other areas, capacity planning, better terms of payment, and so on, that you can start working on as well.
Thank you, Rick. I think to summarize before I thank all speakers is that we work in a global supply chain. I think that requires global responsibility. So we need enablers and legislation to make that happen. We need to make sure that workers can collective bargain for better wages and to unionize, to share their voices. We need suppliers to have a way to communicate their challenges as well. And we need to enable an environment that is open to that and not punishes violations, but actually works together on solutions. And obviously we need brand support on collaboration and this all as well. I mean, I don't think anyone is intentionally making things worse for workers in global supply chains. I don't just think we need a bit of more of a partnership approach to do that. Just to want to say, because we're in Southeast Asia, we're working on the RPP in shrimp supply chains project, and as this is a UN forum on Asia, I thought I highlighted it. We're collaborating together with Freedom Fund and Humanity United on a 3-year project, working with European, UK, Australian, and US retailers to improve purchasing practices. Southeast Asia and South Asia have been identified as important sourcing countries for the shrimp supply chains. We have been running stakeholder engagements the last week here in Thailand, hearing a bit more on understanding the problem and hearing people's perspectives on what is happening, how is the supply chain engaging, what does the structure look like, and we're hoping to draft an assessment report on that. We do a bit of a desk research on how responsible purchasing practices is sometimes purchasing practices is in violation with the ETI base codes, and hoping to produce that by the end of this year. And obviously we're working also to a common framework for the shrimp supply chain, because every supply chain is slightly different. Yes, the overarching principles do apply, but I think the implementation and the nitty-gritty and how supply chains work is slightly different. I want to thank all the speakers very much for joining us today. I want to give the floor actually to you to see if you guys have any questions. If you want any resources, I tried to do something very techy and try to put, if you can scan the QR code, you find all the common frameworks, all the resources that we've been working on. a bit on your European legislation and responsible purchasing practices. So feel free to scan it and browse through the resources that we have created. But I want to see if anyone has any questions for the panelists. I see Chloe putting her hand up at first. Chloe, go ahead.
Hi, it's Chloe from the Freedom Fund. You just kind of referred to this at the very end. I was wondering if you could unpack as a question to ETI, I guess, a wee bit, the differences between different supply chains that you see on this. You mentioned shrimp, stone, garment, banana. They're all very different lengths as well. So if you could unpack some of that. And also just to flag, if the people could come a little bit closer to the mics, it's quite hard to hear at the back. Thank you.
Thank you, Chloe. Yes, of course. I think what, like, originally with the manufacturing project, what we saw was the reason why we did the project in the first place was to see how applicable the common framework was, because the first common framework was created for the apparel and textile industry. So with that project, it was 21-year project to see, okay, how do these principles apply for manufacturing industry? And I do have to say, like, the overarching principles, like equal partnership, collaborative production planning, or fair payment, contract terms, pricing, I think that happens in every industry. Now, looking at it from a shrimp perspective, we are quite far removed from, like for apparel and textile, we normally work a bit more in tier one with the shrimp supply chain. There are a few more tiers in between before we actually reach like farm workers. So I think the idea is that for us to start looking into that and how that plays out. What we have seen so far is, like in conversations what we've heard here like last week, is that actually does have impacts. The price pressures, for example, shrimp has prices for shrimp have come up, production prices have gone down, what people pay the suppliers. Now what we've heard speaking to various workers is that they start to now peel instead, for example, for 100 shrimps a week, they need to peel 200 shrimps, and therefore they then, so to reduce the overtime, and therefore they can't really make that overtime. So it's actually already impacting workers as well. Farmers also feel quite a lot of pressure from like environmental and sustainability compliance, and then maybe processing firms might pay for certification, but then the investment that needs to happen at farm level all falls on the farmer. So I do think, yes, overall it applies, but in the nitty gritty and how we're going to implement it, I do think it differs. We're probably going to look at it from a different perspective in terms of like commodities, just the general apparel and textile supply chains in that sense. Anyone else wants to add? Any more questions?
Hi, my name's Cassidy, policy manager from the World Benchmarking Alliance, WBA, where we assess and benchmark the world's most influential companies on their sustainability performance. So we have a benchmark called the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, and we have 5 years of assessment data, which sort of allows us to observe the high-level trends when it comes to purchasing practices. And I'd like to share some very interesting stats that from our last year's analysis of more than 200 companies in high-risk sectors. So we found that a lot of companies, they have made great progress in terms of including human rights requirements in their contracts with suppliers. So they're now meeting nearly half of the requirements in our assessment. However, when it comes to the progress in terms of purchasing practices, we found that very minimal progress has been made. And over the past 5 years, there has been only 1% of improvement when it comes to purchasing practices, which is really, really worrying, because the gap between actually, on the one hand, you have higher expectations, you have higher requirements set for your suppliers. But on the other hand, the suppliers, the support they receive has been very little. And when you combine that with the regulatory development, for example, the CSDDD coming up, and also the mandatory human rights due diligence law being drafted in some countries, the expectations are expected to rise. But on the other hand, the progress made in purchase practices has been very little. So I guess my first question is that how do we make sure that these emergent regulatory developments and also these industry initiatives can sort of ensure that they don't just push higher standards down to the suppliers, but it also requires companies to reform their own purchasing practices to create the conditions for these suppliers to meet the requirements. And another question is around the sort of performance.
Maybe take first the first question and then the second
Yeah,
question,
yeah,
because otherwise
yeah,
it's quite
up here.
I got lost a bit. Like maybe I will ask one of the panelists to answer the question. Shoshita, do you want to have a go?
I mean, what you're finding.
Mic is broken. No.
Yeah, what you're saying, I think, is disturbing, but not surprising. And just in terms of talking to suppliers, it's kind of really reflects the things that they say, that the requirements are getting more and more, yet we are getting less and less support, and there's a gap. I mean, your question, it's a very difficult one. I mean, how do we kind of change that or move the needle on that? One of the things I've seen being talked about is actually getting a supply, and we were seeing that a little bit too now, especially post pandemic, getting suppliers themselves to collectively come up with standards or collectively come up with sort of requirements from their end, or so that's kind of one aspect, that suppliers mobilizing together. And there are some organizations now that have formed as a result, actually, of COVID and all what was happening during the pandemic, to really sort of bring that supplier perspective. I mean, I think one of the issues, this is a much bigger issue, and it's not really answering your question, but it's just to say that, like, when we're thinking about the regulations that are coming up, I mean, suppliers, workers, generally voices from the global south are not involved in those, forming and putting together those kinds of regulations. So you see oftentimes huge gaps in terms of actually implementing what the regulations require. So, I mean, I'm not, again, I'm not answering your question because I think it's going to, I don't really have an answer per se, but yeah, I mean, there is a little bit of the idea that, we need to bring in that supplier voice in a much more direct way than the past.
I also think, like, purchasing practices, like to have standards is not necessarily one size fits all approach. What work with one supplier doesn't work with the other. So I think dialogue in that sense is much needed to understand, like, what the supply chain looks like and what workers and what suppliers you're dealing with. Contracts might work very well for apparel and textile manufacturers, but maybe for shrimp farmers they don't necessarily want the original contract that's set up. So I think having standards can be tricky to a certain extent. Yes, it might be needed to raise the bar, but we need to be flexible in our approach, thinking that we can't just have a checkbox list and saying this is what good purchasing practices look like, and that's what you need to follow. Can I take one more question from someone else? Yeah, it doesn't. Yeah, maybe two then. Go ahead.
Mahendra from Impact. So my question is generally, like, even if the buyers pay fair prices, let's say, purchasing practices, good responsible purchasing practices. So if you see, when it comes to, let's say, garment exports, or let's say construction industry and all, we have something in garment export called Interstate Migrant Workmen Act, right? In which and I can tell, like, from real example, there is one of the largest garment factories, and they have employing hundreds of migrant workers, and they are not registered under this act. Same goes in the construction sector. You have BOCW Act, which is Building and Other Construction Workers Act, right? In which the workers can get immediate insurance, OPD services, and all this. And you have, like, international organization working, and they hardly know that the subcontractors. No one is registered under this act, right? And then there's another loophole that can be created if the workers under subcontractors are not registered. You get if they ask to register, you get Nepali migrant workers, right? And then the further chain is created where you can, there's no transparency. So how does the brands, look into this? Because it's not only about paying. So if they ask the suppliers to, we pay good prices, but how do you ensure that, they follow on that promise? Because if they are not registered under those acts, so they can all anyway fudge the documents and all, they find a loophole to, see that, we are paying some fair wages. Yeah, that's my question.
Thanks. I think this is very specific to Indian supply chains. What we also need to understand that every migrant worker which is coming to a particular cluster uh, is not actually covered under the Interstate Migrant Workers Act. So, in any non-native worker is not automatically covered under the Interstate Migrant Workers Act because there's no agent many a times who are going to be, bringing them in, which is the requirement of the act. So brands do look at this, that how the recruitment process is happening and how it is being involved. And since many a times what is happening that these recruitments are happening through the skill training centers, and then they are recruiting from there, then it does not get covered under the Interstate Migrant Workers Act. But certainly there are clusters where there are specific source state offices are there who really help those workers who have come through agents to get themselves registered. And certainly in those cases, it has to be registered, and that's where brands would certainly be forcing the suppliers to get them registered and comply to all legal requirements as such. So again, the crux here is that not every non-native worker is covered under the Interstate Migrant Workers Act. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think also brands can take some responsibility if we want responsible recruitment. I think if we talk about responsible purchasing practices, migrant workers are very key, important stakeholders in the entire supply chain. If we want certain products, brands can also take some responsibility in like making sure that responsible recruitment is happening. And second, advocate for unionization and collective bargaining agreements and freedom of association. It's so key for workers to advocate for rights themselves. So I think the international community can start for advocating also for that from a global perspective. But I want to thank the audience for the interesting questions. I want to thank the panelists for the interesting discussion. And if you want to talk to me or talk to any of our panelists later today, just come and have a chat. Thank you so much.